Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast as we had an action-packed weekend full of football, and we are sort of continuing to just iron out all of the different takeaways. Week 3 of the NFL preseason, so we got very few starters sort of pop up across the league, but we did get the first look at Bryce Young for ahead of the 2024 season, which I want to hit on a little bit because Bryce Young obviously had a very disappointing rookie season. We've talked about this on the show before. Some of it due to his own fault, but in large part, it was because of incompetence that surrounded him. And I've been really anticipating seeing what he looks like once again. And, you know, Dave Canales and the Panthers didn't allow us to get that look for a little bit there, as Young and the starters didn't play in either of the first 2 preseason games, but we at least finally got some brief experience with him this past weekend as we saw the Panthers roll out their starters to face off against the Bills, and ultimately only one drive out of that starting unit, but it looked pretty good. Now, all of this to be said before we go any further here, obviously it's against backup defenders in Buffalo, so can't be throwing any parades based off of how the starting offense looked in that drive. But I mean, overall, pretty encouraging to see. Now again, take that for what it may be, but Bryce Young, 6 of 8, 70 yards and a touchdown. So sort of looking a little bit deeper into it, one of the main things that caught my eye in this game with Bryce Young was the fact that when you look at Dave Canales and understanding that he has been sort of made out to be this quarterback guru over the past couple years based off of what he did with Geno Smith in 2022 as the passing game coordinator in Seattle, with Baker Mayfield in 2023 as their offensive coordinator. It's this idea that he can be able to build a system and an offensive play style that better suits these players that do have talent and have experience in different ways and such. But one of the things that stood out to me in this game was the fact that you could see a number of designed play action plays, but not just that, but bootlegs and rollouts where they were trying to move the pocket, get Bryce Young in a little bit of space. I know that he's short, which is something that rightfully so is talked about. I think it can get a little bit overblown at some time, but you know, you do have to consider that he is small, and I think that ultimately that sort of leads people to forget about how athletic he was when he was at Alabama, that he was able to use his legs and scramble out, and that's what I thought he did a pretty good job of showing, at least in this preseason game. And I think that almost the fact that you can look at that as well as part of a knock on his height, that they weren't totally trying to have him just sit back in the pocket. Now, they did a couple times. Thought the blocking on the offensive line was very good. Again, backups. But when Bryce Young was sitting in the pocket as well, I thought he made some nice plays. So by no means am I trying to tell you that that can't be a part of the Panthers offense this upcoming season, but I thought it was pretty interesting, again, especially after holding off on playing Bryce Young and company over these first couple weeks. What message did Dave Canales want to send during his first game? I think it's that a little bit you're going to see some different looks. We're going to be seeing Bryce Young maybe on the move a little bit this upcoming season. They spent big money in the offseason to bring in offensive guards in Damian Lewis and Robert Hunt to try and beef up that group, but that doesn't mean necessarily the Panthers are just going to be ready to have Bryce Young sit back and take a whole lot of hits in the pocket. Now, again, we'll see even more so what that does look like when we get some legitimate NFL defenses rushing him. That's where I start to draw a little bit more concerns. But ultimately, yeah, it was a very successful drive. Run game looked fine for them as well. So, preseason, can't preface it enough that this is against backups and we can't put too much stock into it. But the overall process in which Carolina put together, I thought was pretty solid. We have a comment here from Anthony Manzano. He says, I live around a lot of Carolina Panthers fans, and we were talking about this preseason game, and even after his great performance, they still don't have faith in Bryce as their franchise quarterback, and they want to move on and probably try to draft someone in this draft coming up. I'll be honest, I was never quite as sold on Bryce Young as others coming into the draft either, so I can understand that. It's going to be a little difficult, I feel like, for Carolina to fully make that move, especially after it's not like they just sat at the top of the draft and took him. They moved up, traded DJ Moore, and the pick that ended up being Caleb Williams in this 2024 draft in order to get Bryce Young. So I do think there's going to be a little bit of a pride factor from that front office of trying to do everything they can to make this work. Now, again, that's just sort of speculation there. It's not a great way to go about business, is sort of make up for your previous mistakes like that and try and dig yourself out of a hole that you've already dug. So I understand that that's not a super convincing argument, but that being said, I think the Panthers are going to try and sort of turn this thing around. They gave Dave Canales a 6-year contract, which is a little bit unprecedented in terms of head coach deals are usually 3, 4, 5 years. I think that there were 2 actually head coaches who got 6 years this season, and it was Dave Canales and Mike McDonald, both younger coaches, both coming into younger teams. And I think that it's a little bit of a statement from the front office that we are acknowledging that this might take a little bit of time. So I think that the way that this is going to play out, unless Bryce Young really, really struggles this year and looks unplayable, I think he probably has 2 years. Otherwise, I don't think that they're giving him the full 4 years of his initial deal. There's a lot of holes to plug on that roster, so I think they bring in Canales, again, this quarterback guru, and the thought process is that he will be able to, in a couple years, properly determine whether or not Bryce Young can have success in the NFL. And I wouldn't be super optimistic on it. To your other point, Anthony, of maybe looking to draft someone in the 2025 draft, I'm just not sure at this point. Now, we still have a full college football season. Every year we talk ourselves into guys, so, this might be a little bit ignorant to say, coming into the college football season, but I don't know how many quarterbacks teams are really going to be wanting to move off of past players. Like, I think Carson Beck out of Georgia has a chance to be a top 10-ish pick, maybe higher, probably higher if he has a good year this season. I don't think he necessarily got enough credit over last season for what he was able to do. Shedeur Sanders is obviously one of the more polarizing guys in college football, more so because of his dad, but also those weird reports that came out about opposing coaches thinking that Sanders takes sacks purposefully. And, that's probably not even the case, but either way, we don't know what he looks like even in front of or behind an average offensive line. That I think it's going to be tough for teams to fully talk themselves into that. But again, it's very much on the table. Anthony says, I agree with you that that's a bad way to do business, and that's what I noticed with the Dolphins, that they're desperate to have a franchise quarterback, that they sign a kid to a massive contract, even though he hasn't proven anything. I don't care about the stats. It's more about the performances at the end of the season and leading up to the playoffs. I 100% agree with you there. And especially when you bring in the Dolphins example there, I think that there's a little bit of extra baggage with the way the Dolphins went about business with quarterback Tua Tagovailoa and signing him to that deal, because just a couple years ago, and obviously this became vocalized once again when Tua last week went on the Dan Le Batard show and talked about how Brian Flores really messed with his confidence level, that there was this pretty public fallout between Brian Flores and Tua, and that the organization was a little bit at a crossroads. We're either going to move on with Brian Flores, who had been a pretty good coach in Miami. I'm not saying he's worth the value that Tua gives you, but Brian Flores is a pretty good defensive mind in my eyes between him and Tua. And especially the fact that Flores, at least from what the reports sound like, he was so in on Herbert, and he was saying that the Dolphins made a mistake that year. The Dolphins do, again, in that front office, want to prove that taking Tua wasn't a bad decision in that class over Herbert, even though I think the majority of NFL fans would acknowledge that Justin Herbert is the better quarterback and has the higher upside. That's at least my opinion. I think that's probably the popular opinion, but if you disagree, let us know in the comment section. But prove that pick was all right, and prove that, dumping Brian Flores for Tua was undoubtedly the right decision. And I think that there is upside with Mike McDaniel there, but that being said, I don't think that Tua is necessarily the quarterback who, once he's making over $50 million, once the rest of the roster takes a little bit of a step back, that he is going to be able to elevate everybody. And sort of turning this back to Bryce Young, yes, it's the way they go about business. These ownerships are prideful. Now, I don't want to be mistaken here. I do believe that Carolina just signed a new general manager this offseason. So if that is to be the case, they wouldn't have been the ones to make the deal on, in particular, whoever that general manager is, wouldn't have been the one to take Bryce Young first overall, make that trade, but the front office has to sign off on it as well, and that includes ownership. And David Tepper, we know he has a tendency to be a little bit over-involved at times, that he probably has some stake on it as well. So again, 6-year deal for Canales. I think that the plan for the Panthers is Bryce Young has 2 years to show something. One, if things go really bad this year, and that they're going to, move forward, see what Canales, this offensive-minded guy, seems to be pretty innovative, what he can do for Bryce Young if they can harness any of that talent that made Bryce Young an electric college football player. But is that ever going to translate to the NFL? Definitely a lot of question marks there. But I was glad to see him back on the field. This is somebody that, has, again, I wouldn't even say he's faced that much scrutiny. I think he gets a lot of excuses made for him. I'm pretty mixed feelings. I want him to succeed, because I think that he was set up to fail a little bit by the Panthers here, and I just would prefer, an NFL league where there are a number of good quarterbacks, and that's just not reality at the end of the day. But that being said, the Panthers have a lot of places they need to upgrade on the offense and on the roster as a whole. So this isn't just a Bryce Young indictment. This is about how the team as a whole is operating and how they are going to reorient moving forwards under Dave Canales. But again, let us know whatever thoughts you have in the comments section, but we're going to be taking a quick break here, and when we come back on the other side, I want to fire off a handful of different NFL headlines from this weekend with some key injury updates. We have a suspension from Zay Jones as well, so want to dive into all of that. But first, quick break. Do not go anywhere. We will be right back.